The Atheist Debates Patreon project presents a debate review of Matt Dillahunty and Caleb Jackson on the resurrection. Hey, hope you guys are doing well. Still, I guess, recording here in the alternate space as we wait for air conditioners to get fixed and other stuff. This was a debate that I did just a couple of days ago. And to be fair, it was not billed as a debate. It was billed as a discussion, hey, we're going to sit down and have a discussion about, the resurrection of Jesus and whether or not it occurred, whether or not it's reasonable to believe it, etc. But in all honesty, all of these are essentially debates. If you're going to have two people come in to talk about an issue with opposing points of view, and one's making a case for why we should believe one thing, and another one's making a case for why we shouldn't believe that thing, or why we should believe something else, you're still talking about a debate. And while I've done lots of these debates, including debates on the resurrection, even in recent months, the plan here was to have this be a little bit different. First of all, it was shorter, and so we had 1 hour. I'm working on this being a more regular debate or discussion format. I think that the process of let me present my case really quickly with some detail, and then let's immediately start talking about it. Let's ask the questions. Let's, get below the hood. Because if you think about it, when we're talking about a proposition that one person is defending, we don't need two big opening statements. We don't need here's all of the evidence and reason and justification to establish my epistemology and the resurrection of Jesus. And then here's all of my thoughts and epistemology about why this is not the case and everything else, and then get into discussion. You can just say, here's why I'm convinced, and then start having the discussion. It can be as simple as asking questions. In this particular debate, one thing that I wanted to do, and was very clear from the outset, was I wanted to talk about the nature of evidence and what makes it believable, which is something we've tried to do in a number of different debates. But I wanted to come up with an example. I'm constantly working to see if we can come up with better examples. And the problem with all of these examples is that they're going to be analogies, and analogies are always going to fail at some point. But coming up with the best one you can is often the best that you can do. And so it was important to make sure that we talked about asking the right questions and talking about things in context. So the example that I came up with for this particular debate showed the difference between a lottery and the fact that a lottery, the odds of any individual specifically winning a lottery are very unlikely. But the odds that with many people playing, the lottery is going to be hit with some frequency are very likely. And the example was basically if someone said, hey, someone won the Powerball last night, we don't bat an eye about it because that's something we know has happened. We've witnessed it happening. We witnessed it happening with fairly good regularity. We can even calculate how often and how likely it's going to happen, given, all the information about how many people are playing. But if somebody said, hey, I won the Powerball last night, we don't shrug that off with the same sort of immediate recognition. Because now we know the person. Now there's a specific person. Now there's something different about this. And so while it's likely that someone hit the Powerball at some point, it's not necessarily likely that you hit the Powerball. And the way I spun this for the resurrection debate is that if we lived in a world where resurrections were rare but known to happen, we would still, for any specific resurrection, say, I need to see, specific evidence of this. It wouldn't necessarily be mountains of extraordinary evidence. It would just be like, here's the winning ticket, here's the winning numbers, let's see the check that you got type of thing. But we don't live in a world where resurrections are already as common as lottery winning. It's just not the case. And so we now would need to demonstrate, if someone says a resurrection occurred, that not only is that possible, which we've got no demonstration of, but that it's likely given the circumstances, and that it in fact almost certainly happened for the individual in question. Now, Caleb Jackson was a very good interlocutor. I don't think that we made any real ground on getting to a sound epistemology. And interestingly, while the discussion was very cordial and we both had points to make, I don't feel that there were strong responses to questions about strong evidence. What are your reasons for believing this? There was a seeming appeal that, well, this is just about the best evidence that we could expect. We have a report that's a couple thousand years old. This predates the ability to, video record and other stuff. It predates modern medicine, so you're not necessarily going to get doctors' reports and stuff. We don't have the ability to look at DNA research. There's pretty much nothing about this that is investigatable with regard to empirical evidence. And so Caleb rightly says that, this is just about the best evidence we could expect, except that's just about the best evidence we could expect if, in fact, there isn't a God trying to perform this resurrection and then safeguard the information about the resurrection. That is the death knell for the claims about the resurrection of Jesus, with it being supposedly the single most important event that has ever occurred. If it's true, nothing could be more important. If in fact the salvation of every human being is tied to an acceptance and recognition of this resurrection, it has to be the single most important fact in history. And if there is a God who's capable of achieving this resurrection, and a God that wants people to have a rational justification for accepting this resurrection, then saying, well, this is the best evidence we could have, it's simply not true, because that God could present evidence. That God could presumably, if time travel is amongst its abilities, cart us around through time and show us, could produce concrete evidence of this, could have, instead of doing it back then when there wasn't video evidence in modern medicine, could have done it now. There are many, many, many different ways that one could think of where an all-powerful being could overcome this hurdle of, well, this is the best evidence you could expect from first century Judea. Now, I will point out that Caleb also pointed me to another resurrection claim, which I'm going to do a separate video about, that supposedly happened around 2001 in Nigeria. And at the time, of course, I wasn't familiar with it, or I didn't recall hearing about it, though I probably heard about this at some point, just because I've worked with a number of skeptic organizations. And somebody from Center for Inquiry in Nigeria investigated it. But we'll get to that when we review the resurrection claim. The claim, though, is one where all I cared about initially was, does Caleb accept this claim of resurrection? And I was going to say to his credit, but maybe it's to his detriment. I don't know. He does. He's convinced that this other resurrection story is also true. And that at least puts him on fairly consistent grounds with regard to what sort of evidence he requires in order to accept that someone was raised from the dead. Unfortunately, there are really good reasons to show that, and demonstrably good reasons that show that this is not a good methodology for accepting that a resurrection occurred. Because in this case, what we have is a bunch of reports. It's not like we've verified anything. This doesn't rise to the level of a scientific journal publishing a shocking tale of someone rising from the dead without an explanation. If we had, concrete confirmation of the facts about the case and that there had been an actual raising from the dead, we still wouldn't know how or why it happened. And that's a point that I get to in most of the resurrection debates. But we could at least agree that it happened. This takes me back to the debate that I did with Mike Lacona on the resurrection, where he tried to present a case where someone had their head lopped off and we walked into the other room and they came walking in later with their head back on. Now, yes, that violates everything we know about the natural world. You can't just chop somebody's head off and have it put back on, perhaps with some extraordinary surgery and stuff, but there's a reason the Highlander movies are like, when your head comes away from your neck, it's over. I agree. And yet the thing I pointed out in that debate is, one, we don't have that example. We never have that example. It's neat when theologians and apologists come forward and say, hey, here's a hypothetical. Would that convince you? Their plan when they do this is just to try to frame you as being unreasonable. Like, even if Matt watched someone's head get chopped off and then saw them alive a little later, he still would not believe in a resurrection. That's not true. As I pointed out to Mike Lacona, I would happily believe that the person I witnessed alive, the person I saw die, and this person has come back to life, provided there's a good chain of evidence and everything else. What I wouldn't know is how. I wouldn't know how that person came back to life. Was it through some medical technology? Was it through some aspect of natural order and biology that I don't know about? Was it through the intervention of a god? I don't know. And we don't know how to test for or identify the supernatural or supernatural causation. Because what we ended up with the story about Jesus from Caleb is confirmation that this is just a story, or just a collection of stories, a collection of copies of translations of copies from individuals we can't source, from people we can't interview, from people and facts about the world that we can't investigate. And so you have to just take this as so many people believed this that it's reasonable to accept. And that's quite frankly what you get most of the time, is that it's absurd to think that these individuals who knew Jesus could possibly lie or be wrong. And the problem is, you don't have anything that confirms you are hearing from someone who was an eyewitness or someone who knew this. And even if you did, we know that eyewitnesses can be wrong and that texts can be changed. We don't have any original copies of the books. There's a load of problems. None of this demonstrates that a resurrection did not occur in the case of Jesus. But it puts us in a position where we have to recognize that we cannot reasonably conclude that a resurrection did occur. And when you look at this through the lens of, there is a God that could prove this, there is a God that did want to do this, there is a God that is going to judge you based on your assessment in some models of this, it no longer makes sense. It's one thing to say, hey, you don't get to look at this and suggest that because the stories are coming from believers, therefore there's a natural bias and it's all propaganda. It would be a mistake to conclude that that is the case. It wouldn't be a mistake at all to be suspicious that that could contribute to the case. But pointing that out, which is a worthy skeptical note, doesn't in any way suggest that we can't look at this and suggest there are people who believe something and maybe there's bias involved. But what does the evidence say? And if the best that we get is, you're not really going to get good evidence because of the time frame of this or anything else, I don't know what else to do. One note that I almost regret, but I think it was important and it's worth addressing. I'm probably going to have to do a video on the difference between an ad hominem fallacy and just an assessment of someone's thinking or character or whatever when it's not a fallacy. Because I pointed out that I'm a little concerned by individuals whose methodology for determining facts of reality leads them to the conclusion that a resurrection occurred based on this paltry information that they have here. And yet this same model of thinking leads to a rejection of evolution, a rejection of vaccine science. Now, there were people who essentially looked at that and said, this is Matt, he's doing an ad hominem attack, and this isn't even Caleb's position. And he's just trying to say, look at how stupid these people are. They don't believe in vaccines, but they do believe in resurrections. There's nothing about this that was remotely an attack on Caleb or anybody else. As a matter of fact, I was very clear that Caleb's not under any obligation to defend this. I don't know what Caleb's views are on evolution and vaccine, but I suspected that he's a fairly reasonable person. This wasn't an objection to him, and it wasn't an attack on any people. It was a consideration of an epistemological framework. It doesn't matter who the people are. If your method for moving towards an accurate understanding of reality has you believing a resurrection that you can't source, that you have no empirical evidence for at all, that is wholly inconsistent with the facts of reality and everything we know about biology and science, and yet has you rejecting the same science or the better science. You're accepting something based on weaker evidence than what you're rejecting if you reject evolution and vaccines and things like that. It's a fair point to evaluate an epistemology that's being put forth. I would love to have a further conversation with Caleb where we specifically talk about what sort of epistemology we're actually advocating for. Because I will be accused and guilty, quite frankly, on many occasions, of scientism, that I'm saying science is the only way to know things. That's not actually what I'm saying, but I think that pretty much anything that's going to demonstrate itself as a reliable path of knowing still has to demonstrate itself with the most reliable means available currently, which means you would have to, like if you came up with a more accurate ruler, you would have to show that it's at least as accurate in measurements as the previous ruler, and then show that it's, more. Well, that sort of thing has to happen too. If you're going to say that you have something other than science that is a better way of knowing or a better way of getting to the truth, then you have to demonstrate that it is reliably getting you to the truth. And if you had an epistemology that was consistently leading you to demonstrable truths, and that epistemology suggested that a resurrection occurred, now you'd be on better footing. Wouldn't necessarily confirm it, but it would be great. I would love for that to happen. That doesn't happen. The sort of epistemological framework that people offer when they're talking about their religious beliefs or the supernatural, that framework is never clear, and it never demonstrates any efficacy. It doesn't ever say, this is true. Here we can demonstrate this is demonstrably true. And here's how I reached the conclusion that this was believable. While you didn't believe it, it is demonstrably true. And here's the method that I used to reach that. And then we take that method and we start applying it to similar claims to see how reliable that method is. Because flipping a coin is a method. And for simple yes, no, questions, it's going to be right 50% of the time. I don't think any of us consider that particularly impressive. Guessing, Charlie out on a four answer multiple choice thing is probably going to be effective on average 25% of the time. You could make it so that it doesn't, but just guessing, blind guessing is going to get you there. There's no reason to think that a conclusion reached without any demonstration of truth or fact in any way demonstrates a reliable method of reaching truth. Faith is not a reliable method of reaching truth. Guessing is not a reliable method. Flipping a coin is not a reliable method. Trusting your lucky rabbit's foot or your lucky socks, those are not reliable methods of making decisions. What method is being used to confirm that this resurrection likely happened? It's certainly not science. It is certainly not fact and evidence-based. It is not rooted in empirical evidence at all. It is based on, and pretty much nothing more than, testimony. And in the case of the testimonies that we have from the Bible, unverifiable, unknown sources that we can't investigate. And while everyone is entitled to think that that is a good method to determine, a resurrection happened, I don't think that that's what's actually happening. I don't think anybody's come to believe in a resurrection because of good evidence. I think people have come to believe in a resurrection because they were compelled and convinced by stories and appeals to these people wouldn't lie, and we have a really good historical record of this, and so many other people have believed it, all of which are demonstrably fallacious. As soon as there is a non-fallacious, demonstrably sound epistemology that confirms a resurrection, I'll be on board like everybody else. See you next time. Bye-bye.